Vladimir Putin thought his special forces would be within Kyiv within hours. I thought they'd be within Kyiv within hours. They were actually attacking the airport just outside Kyiv, Hostomel Airport. Russia had the plan in place to take over those key buildings in Kyiv, and Vladimir Zelensky was asked, you might remember, if he would leave. The Americans said they would take him out of Kyiv, uh, take him to Lviv in the west. Zelensky said, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. If you can overcome that challenge, that the very existence of your nation, let alone your personal future, that of your family, is at stake, and if Ukrainians continue to face those challenges and do so 19 months later, who are we to say that they should stop?
What do you make of Ukrainian movement around the Black Sea? Ukraine claims that it has retaken oil and gas platforms from Russian control.
So the latest development in the Black Sea front of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a Ukrainian success. The Ukrainian military says it has taken a series of oil and gas platforms in the Black Sea. These platforms are important primarily to the Russians for military purposes because you can use them for naval positioning. And of course, Russia is working out of the Black Sea to do two things. One is that they are trying to reimpose the blockade on Ukrainian ports, but they're also using the Black Sea position to continue with these missile strikes on a daily basis, especially trying to hit Ukraine's port and energy infrastructure and grain stores. So the more that you can start to take back part of the Black Sea, and we saw this to a limited extent before with the regaining of Snake Island. That island was very symbolic in the opening days of the war for Ukrainian defiance. The more you can regain parts of the Black Sea, you weaken the blockade at a time when Ukraine is talking about setting up a protected grain corridor uh, to get the supplies moving again. But you also begin to limit the Russian capabilities to keep lobbing these missiles into the mainland, as it were, as Russia faces the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
We also saw this morning that Ukraine claimed that they made an overnight attack on the port of Sevastopol. They struck a Russian landing ship and a submarine. What's your reaction to this news?
So, in another front of this link between Black Sea operations and what happens on land, have been these series of Ukrainian strikes. They go back to the summer of 2022 on Russian occupied Crimea, which, of course, is a peninsula that juts into the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And the latest operation this week has been this attack. The Ukrainians are being very close-lipped as to whether it was cruise missiles, whether it was unmanned boats, naval drones. We've heard claims of both. But whatever was used, yes, it damaged at least two Russian warships. It damaged a submarine that was in this shipyard normally used for repairs. But it also damaged a landing craft, a large landing craft. And I think that's the real significance here, because this is the second landing craft that the Ukrainians have hit. The start of August, they badly damaged, almost sank a landing craft in a Russian port in southwest Russia near the Ukrainian border. Now, Russia doesn't have that many large landing craft for the type of movement of troops and weapons that they need, especially again as they face the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So if this is serious damage to a second large Russian landing craft, they do face a real constriction on what they're going to be able to do to move between Russia, Crimea, and southern Ukraine. And so all the naval attacks have a significance, but I think this one is especially important if we get confirmation of serious damage to that landing craft.
And we're just in general, like we're seeing a lot more movement in this kind of region with the Black Sea attack and what happened in Sevastopol. I mean, with all of this combined, should we be looking much more attentively at Crimea?
Crimea has been a front of this war since last summer 2022. Now, we don't normally think of it as a front line because it's not a clash of armies there. There's no Ukrainian ground forces that have yet gone into Crimea. That's not likely. even if you get success in the counteroffensive in the rest of southern Ukraine as well as in the east. But what you have had is a war which has been taking place, which is to degrade the Russian capabilities, first of all, to maintain an offense, to try to overrun Ukraine, and then as we move from 2022 into 2023, to degrade the Russian ability to defend itself and to hold on to the territory that it occupies. So it's not just hitting in Crimea the naval headquarters in Sevastopol. It's not only hitting both naval and air bases, it's hitting oil depots, it's hitting ammunition depots, it's hitting other supply and logistics positions. And what has been striking about those months of attacks is that the Russians appear unable to set up adequate air defenses to protect the range of military positions, the range of military resources that they have there. Now, clearly, Russia has, an awful lot of firepower that's still there. We're not talking about Ukraine defeating Russia in Crimea with the missile attacks, the drone attacks, but it's hindering, it's constricting Russia. And to put this in the wider context that we're talking about both the Black Sea and the counteroffensive, there's a lot of mistaken chatter in the media. And I can explain why if you want, but there's a lot of mistaken chatter in the media about, oh, there's the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which started in June. Oh, it's failing because it hasn't gotten the sudden breakthrough. It hasn't swept through the south and the east. That was never the point of this Ukrainian counteroffensive. This Ukrainian counteroffensive, if you link the land operations in the south and the east of Ukraine to liberate occupied territory with the attacks that take place in Crimea and the Black Sea, it was to gradually put a squeeze on Russia because Russia can always throw more men onto the front. We know that. They can mobilize more men. But if they cannot supply those men, if they cannot provide fuel, if they cannot provide transport, if they cannot provide air cover, if they cannot provide the positions in the Black Sea to support those men, then they will have more and more difficulties holding on to the territory that they've claimed in this invasion.
And we had Hamish de Bretton Gordon on last week, I believe, on Frontline, and he was kind of reacting to the destruction of a Challenger 2 tank. And he's in his position as a former tank commander. He was saying these tanks are actually going to be really instrumental in the fight for Crimea. And if Ukraine manages to kind of strangle Crimea and cut it off, which he says we're on the path to doing, it would have very detrimental consequences for Putin. And you could see sort of a coup kind of thing happen because Crimea is so significant for Russia and for Ukraine. I wonder if you kind of feel the same way about that.
Well, Hamish de Bretton Gordon is an excellent analyst. I've been fortunate to work alongside him for years, including over Russia's operations in Syria. So, we've learned from that experience as analysts, but I think we also have to learn from the Ukrainian side. And that is, I don't think we're talking about a military offensive into Crimea itself, at least not in the near future. Uh, the Ukrainians told the USCI Director William Burns near the start of the counteroffensive in June, and they've actually leaked it to the media since then, that the objective is to get to the borders of Crimea. So you go through Zaporizhia and Kherson regions in the south, and you get to the border of Crimea. You've liberated southern Ukraine, except for the peninsula, and then it's okay, Vlad, okay, Mr. Putin, what are you going to do now? And it is then at that point that you talk about the prospect of political negotiations for a Russian withdrawal from Crimea. Now, Ukraine has said throughout this invasion, Zelensky said it as early as March, April 2022, and he's reiterated it, there can be a process to determine the future of Crimea. And we can talk about a process which will involve whether it's through political negotiations, whether it's through a referendum. Now, a lot of Ukrainians don't want that. So, it may not be referendum, but some type of process, which is a political process for the Russians to finally pull out of Korea so you don't have this final defeat, this final last stand of Russia, precisely because Crimea is so symbolic for Putin. I mean, he seized this territory in 2014 as a counteroffensive when the pro-Russian leader, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted from power by popular protest. But it wasn't just counterattacking in 2014 and holding on to Crimea. It was trying to make Crimea a symbol of a Russia beyond Russia, as it were. And there have been cultural efforts for almost a decade of trying, with language, with schools, with the infrastructure, with just simply trying to make people in Crimea Russian citizens. So Crimea is a step beyond even what we've seen with the 2022 invasion. So at this point, and I stress at this point because it could change, I think we're still talking for a political end game with Crimea rather than a military one.
But Ukraine, what before Sorovikin was ousted, I guess, and fired, and we've seen a lot of stuff, happen with him since the mutiny and Prigozhin's death. But before all of that happened, he was laying some really difficult defenses for the Ukrainians to get through, kind of on their path to Crimea. I mean, how difficult is it going to be for the Ukrainians to push south?
Well, I think the Ukrainian counteroffensive back in June, and again, to knock out the myth, there is a myth that everybody knew or everybody expected a quick advance um, on the southern front through the Zaporizhia region. Well, no, everybody did not expect a quick advance. If you actually listen to the Ukrainian officials, they knew it was going to be a tough fight, precisely because of what is called the Surovikin line, which is named for General Sergei Surovikin, who was the commander of Russian forces in late 2022, early before he was replaced. And those defenses consist of things such as minefields, trenches, wire, and it was precisely to hold up the advance of armored units. And those defense lines worked very well in the first phase of the counteroffensive back in June. I do think that although Ukrainian forces knew it was going to be a tough road ahead, I do think they may have underestimated the extent of the minefields. And they may have underestimated that Russia, which has had a series of failures on the battlefield, they got the tactics right in the early stage of the counteroffensive, which is that when the armored vehicles were held up by the minefields, even if they hadn't actually been damaged by the minefields, you bring in artillery, you bring in air power to then hit the armor, which isn't moving, which is static on the battlefield. And I'd say that there was a reassessment. The Ukrainians and the military forces working with them, including the British, including European forces, including the Americans, reassessed what was happening and they have adjusted their tactics. They've adjusted their tactics so that they don't lose as much armor. Uh, they certainly are not losing as much manpower, given that this armor, even when it's hit, protects the troops. You don't have as many troops being killed when a tank is struck. But it does mean that in terms of protecting that armor, you had to move very slowly through those minefields. And Ukraine has had a shortage of demining equipment. That's been a real bottleneck for the offensive. Now, where we are in September is that we are now seeing a notable advance on the southern front. It's not a rapid advance. We're probably talking about 15 to 18 kilometers to the south that's taken place, but it is a notable advance in getting beyond that first Russian defense line. That first Russian defense line, there are three in Zaporizhia. About 60% of the effort uh, for the Surovikin line was devoted to this first layer. Now, if you're past that, you still have a second and a third line to get through, but there hasn't been as much effort to beef up those lines. Um, what you're really looking at is probably Ukraine advancing towards a strategic hub named Tokmak, but then making that move towards the port city of Melitopol. And it really is a question, I think, of how much territory they get through, probably in the next 30 to 45 days. Because then you do have winter coming in. It doesn't make it impossible to maintain the offensive, but the winter conditions can make it more difficult, especially when you're talking about that transition with slush rather than frozen ground, which obviously can hold up armored vehicles. So what I'd say, I think when you and I talked in our last chat, closer to the start of the counteroffensive, what I said is, look, this is not a sprint. It may not be a marathon, but it's at least a 1,500-meter race. And I think we're in this position that you're talking about a counteroffensive that is going to continue in the south and in the east into 2024. unless Putin was to suddenly fall from power in Russia, which I don't expect to happen, and a sudden collapse of Russian politically, which means that uh, Ukraine continues to succeed gradually in terms of liberation of territory. Uh, but it is not going to be something which is going to be like a sudden victory moment. It's going to have to be one which continues to respect the wishes of Ukrainians to liberate their land almost piece by piece, kilometer by kilometer.
I also wanted to ask you about what we've seen. Kim Jong Un is in Russia. He's meeting with Vladimir Putin for weapons talks. I mean, what can North Korea realistically give to Russia?
What North Korea can give to Russia on the military front is artillery and munitions. I mean, Russia's losing a lot of artillery pieces in trying to hold back the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And North Korea, which is a very artillery heavy army, can provide a supply. Now, I think that means that Russia can sort of plug some gaps, but I don't think it means it can turn the battlefield for quite obvious reasons. North Korean artillery might enable you to defend your lines, but it doesn't mean you can go back on the offensive and sweep through the east south of Ukraine. Those days are gone. So at best, North Korea gives Vladimir Putin a little bit of breathing space on the military front, but I think that comes with political issues. And I think the political dimension of this visit is almost as significant. First of all, in the specific sense regarding the military aid, if Russia accepts this aid, and in fact, Russia's asked for this aid, they aren't saying so publicly, but they have. They're breaking a UN resolution that's been in place since 2006, an arms embargo. And that doesn't mean not only no arms go to South Korea because of their nuclear program, it means North Korea cannot deliver arms anywhere. So Russia's going to have to defy the international community, and they're creating a pretext for it today. Um, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said, "Oh well, the 2006 resolution was in a different time, it was in a different political environment, and the U.S. and the West they've betrayed North Korea on the humanitarian front, blah blah blah." So Russia's setting up the conditions to break the UN resolution, but that further isolates Russia politically. There are reasons why North Korea has been sanctioned. Uh, we've seen Russia continue to defy or try to defy international isolation by maintaining the attacks on civilian areas with the war crimes that it's committed inside Ukraine. And we've had people and you'll hear the pro-Russian folks, the pro-Kremlin folks, including in the UK, say today, look, Russia's part still has global respect for what it's doing. Absolutely not. The broader political story here, alongside the Ukrainian counteroffensive, is that countries are distancing themselves from Putin. Not just the West, not just the US, not just Europe. We're talking about China. We're talking about India. We're talking about Saudi Arabia. I have heard, a military analyst today say, well, perhaps China can provide military aid through North Korea to Russia. No, that ain't going to happen. Uh, China has pulled away from Russia in terms of providing military aid since the start of 2023, and they're pulling back politically as well. India, in a piece of news that was missed by almost everyone in the US, in the international media, said 2 weeks ago, we're going to cut back on our purchases of oil from Russia. Now, India had sharply increased purchases from Russia to the point where half of Russian oil exports were going to India this summer. If India pulls back from that, that's a big economic blow to the Russians. The Saudis convened a summit of more than 40 countries and did not invite Russia to talk about Ukrainian sovereignty. Now, what I'm really saying is we go from Kim and we work through other countries like China, India, South Korea, and we go back, Saudi Arabia, and we go back to Kim meeting Vladimir Putin today. When Kim Jong Un is your last best friend internationally, that's not a very good political position to be in.
Yeah, and I wonder there was a North Korean kind of analyst who said that maybe rather than, just ammunition that we see North Korea sending over, we could actually also see North Korean troops being sent over. I mean, do you think there's any likelihood of that?
I don't see North Korean troops being sent across, at least not openly. Because look, once North Korean troops get involved alongside Russian troops, it blows apart the Russian propaganda line that it is defending itself against an international bloc, which includes NATO, includes the West, alongside Ukraine. Because what's Russia doing? Russia's actually taking in troops from another country alongside its offensive. Now, there have been foreign troops, by the way, covertly, who have been involved in Russia's offensive, but we can talk about that at some other point. The big thing here is, first of all, look, militarily, what do North Korean troops add to the front? I mean, it might add a bit of cannon fodder on the front lines, but these are troops that have actually been trained for conflict on the Korean Peninsula in the Asian theater. Those are very different conditions than fighting inside Ukraine on the front lines. The North Korean military system, the North Korean chain of command, its logistics and supply systems are not the same as the Russian systems. So, this isn't a question of very quickly integrating North Korean troops and turning the battle of the war in Ukraine. But I think, even if that was being considered, I don't think it is, but even if it was, I think the political cost, again, and I'll just do the parallel. If Kim Jong Un is your last best political friend, and then North Korea is your last best military friend for providing troops, you're not doing very well in terms of where you're going with this war. And I don't think it's a tenable situation to say, me and Kim versus the world.
Scott, those are all the questions that I had to ask you. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
At this point, you have to ask what Russia's play is, in terms of holding out against the Ukrainian counteroffensive beyond, hoping that the military lines hold. Uh, I don't think they can go for a general mobilization of Russian manpower at this point. I think the September 2022 mobilization went horribly wrong. Hundreds of thousands of Russians fled the country. There was chaos in terms of getting people to the front lines. A lot of those men were not trained properly, were not given adequate resources. I don't think Putin can go down that line again. I think you can continue to try to rely on the missile and the drone strikes that take place. But if we get to the point where there are F-16s that are going into Ukraine, and I think they will be there by the spring of 2024, I think that erodes Russia's advantage in the air. So what does Russia play for? And I'd say that the wild card here is the U.S. elections. I think uh, Vladimir Putin helped get Donald Trump elected in 2016. And yeah, and I am saying to all of you folks who continue to say it's Russiagate, it's not. And I can trot out the evidence for you in our next conversation. Vladimir Putin helped Donald Trump get elected in 2016. And if he can help get Trump elected and the Trumpists, these very loud, vocal representatives, legislators, who only today are saying, we'll impeach Joe Biden. If he can get Trumpists back into Washington in 2024, the play is that Trump will cut the American aid to Ukraine. Now, Donald Trump, you may remember, did cut American military aid to Ukraine in 2019 when he was blackmailing Ukraine to try to spread dirt on Joe Biden. So Donald Trump's got a bit of previous on it. And so, yeah, if we game this out and if Donald Trump was elected as president of the United States, maybe that's a lifeline for the Russians. But that's still, well over a year away. And so I think the Russian play here is to somehow hope against hope that the Trumpists can get control of the American Congress to cut the American aid or to try to restrict it, which means that the biggest card here that Vladimir Putin has to play in the US, in the UK, and in Europe is disinformation. It continues to be disinformation about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, about the political situation, about the cultural situation. And there are very loud voices from both the right and the left who continue to poison British discussion, American discussion, European discussion, because they'll trot out any old Kremlin propaganda line, which makes it very strange that I think Steve, with military forces, failed. He thought he could break Ukraine with a food war, failed. He thought he could break Ukraine with an energy war, failed. Now he's hoping he can do it with a whole group of activists with a disinformation war. We'll keep our eyes and ears open on that front as well.
But on the flip side, that puts Vladimir Zelensky in quite an uncomfortable position where we've got about 10 months until the US presidential elections. And he's basically got 10 months to in case Trump gets elected, in case Vladimir Putin, gets his wish, that, he's gotten as far as he can by that point. That puts him in quite an uncomfortable position, doesn't it?
It puts Vladimir Zelensky, but it also puts a lot of other folks, a lot of people in the world in a challenging position. And I'll put it, and we faced challenging positions before. I mean, there was a challenging position just simply in February 2022, March 2022, for Ukraine to survive. It did. There was a challenging position in the summer of 2022 when Russia advanced in eastern Ukraine for Ukraine not to be broken apart. It did. So those challenges have been overcome before, but let's say where we are right now. It will rely, of course, in terms of what you can do on the battlefield. That's very important. But it also, there was a window here, which was to get the F-16s and fighter jets from other countries. Sweden will be one which I think will make a move in the next couple of weeks to provide fighter jets, by the way. Keep your eyes open on that front. To get those jets in, to get those Ukrainian pilots trained. It will also be, I think, a window on the American front to be looking for this August, or sorry, this autumn. And if that means you then have months to get those new forms of equipment, those missiles, those fighter jets, continue to get the armor in there so that by spring 2024, the momentum continues. The momentum continues. So yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge internally for Ukraine to show that it's serious about fighting against corruption. We've had the replacement of the defense minister recently, which was linked to this. It's a challenge for Ukraine to show that it's fighting against corruption to continue to advance bid to join the European Union. But as you and I speak, Ursula von der Leyen has just told the European Parliament that Ukraine has made significant progress towards accession. So it's a significant challenge on multiple fronts, not just with the US, but also with Europe, also with Asia, for example. Think about allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia. Think about the India position. But you know what? I'm going to come back to this, Morgan. On February the 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin thought his special forces would be within Kyiv within hours. I thought they'd be within Kyiv within hours. They were actually attacking the airport just outside Kyiv, Hostomel Airport. Russia had the plan in place to take over those key buildings in Kyiv. And Volodymyr Zelensky was asked, you might remember, if he would leave. The Americans said they would take him out of Kyiv, uh, take him to Lviv in the west. Zelensky said, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. If you can overcome that challenge, that the very existence of your nation, let alone your personal future, that of your family is at stake, and if Ukrainians continue to face those challenges and do so 19 months later, who are we to say that they should stop?